Welcome, everyone. I'm Spiro with ActivistPost.com. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to be talking about the coronavirus and the COVID-19 vaccine in a very interesting study comparing vaccinated children and unvaccinated children. And joining me today to discuss this is a co-author of the study, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, who is a research scientist, an author, and a public speaker. He also serves as a reviewer of peer-reviewed journals. Now, Dr. Weiler is the president and CEO of the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge, ipackknowledge.org. Welcome, Doctor. Thank you for being my guest today.
Well, thank you, Spiro. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is all mine. I've been following you and your work for some time, and first saw you speak at an event for the Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom some years ago. So I'm definitely glad you could take the time to be here today. Now, you're an expert in biomedicines and biology, among several other areas. You've done work on cancer research. You have even discovered numerous fundamental flaws in methods for analyzing data, and have even devised multiple methods yourself throughout your career. So what areas of science and medicine and research would you say interest you the most and qualifies you, or maybe even quantifies you the best for our discussion today?
Well, thank you, Spiro. It's a great lead-off question. I've seen your show, and I want to say I'm really honored to be here, and I love the work that you're doing. I think anybody that knows your work can appreciate your sincerity and your depth of inquiry. So thanks. I'm very fascinated by how we know things. I mean, the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge is about knowledge, first and foremost. There is a limit to what we can know in certain situations. And science itself is conducted best when we are metacognitive, when we're aware of the limits of our knowledge. And it begins with the design of a study. So in the design of a study, that there are some initial conditions that can determine that a study is going to be robust and rigorous, or that it's going to flop, or that it's just going to be something that doesn't stand the test of time. And I was hired at the University of Pittsburgh because of my skills in bioinformatics in particular, around the question of how do we analyze data from studies that are taking thousands of measurements at the same time of, say, 8,000 or 20,000 genes at a time to determine the risks of cancer, to determine whether people can are likely to do well under different treatment regimens for cancer. So early detection of cancer was a big area I was in for a long time. But nevertheless, designing a study should be tied and married to the design of the analysis. And if you go into these observational studies in psychiatry, if you look at the literature of psychiatry, psychology, and other so-called, historically called soft sciences, they discovered that they were very weak sciences because they would do an analysis and then they would change the design of the analysis and come at it again to see what a different method would tell them. Well, I actually formalized a process by which you can do that objectively and safely. It's called intelligent methods optimization. That's what I mean. You have to be super cognitive. Technically speaking, if you have an objective criteria by which you are comparing different outcomes of your analysis that don't involve looking at the interpretable results. So it's like a mechanic doesn't have to know the speed of a car to know they're tweaking it towards greater speed. They know what certain tweaks are, but they're going to want to test it anyway. So what we do to be in objective science, what we do is we say, what are the hypotheses that we want to know? It's very straightforward. What is the best designed study, the type of study that we can design? If we can't do the type of study that we'd like to do, what's the second best, and so on. But in the design of the study, there are certain characteristics of study design that have to be followed, and we follow them. And then in the data analysis itself, that algorithm, how the actual computations that are done, the mathematical statistical computations, that is either going to be well suited to the design or poorly suited. And different tests for studying, say, associations or correlations or whatever the analysis that you're doing, they have different, it's called intrinsic power. They have different intrinsic power. It's the ability to find something if it's there. And so being metacognitive about all that, being super aware of all of that, then Yeah, that's the thing that intrigues me the most, because the literature is obviously has exploded. Everyone everywhere doing science. There's this massive amount of literature. How can we know which studies are rigorous or robust? How do we hang our hat on whether butter is good for you or bad for you? You know, what the question of cholesterol. And so, yeah, I've been fairly successful in my career in helping people marry their design of analysis to study design. So it's pretty fundamental stuff, but it turns out to be pretty important.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's mainly like actually involved in scientific applied sciences and research. I mean, you guys are doing like the actual real work, figuring out what's causing this and that, and with the studies and in the different various fields. That's pretty amazing. It's awesome. I was always interested in science growing up and going through school and everything like that. It was my favorite course. But now we have a pretty good understanding of you, your background, your area of expertise. Now, can you please provide the viewers with a little bit of information about your colleague who co-authored the study with you?
So my co-author is Paul Thomas, and he headed up the practice. We have data from for 10 and a half years of people that are born into the practice. This way, we don't have people that we don't know their vaccination history, right? So he had 15,000 in the practice all over, but we ended up with 3,700 something. Because people are drawn to his practice. And so we had to isolate the data to the people that were born into the practice as a good step in study design. But Paul himself, Dr. Thomas himself, he's a sweetheart. I mean, he's an angel. He, practiced medicine in South Africa, in the slums of South Africa, at a time when in his career he could have gone anywhere in the world. He has adopted children. I mean, you just can't find a nicer guy. He's really a sweetheart. What impressed me about Paul the most, there are a lot of people who call themselves anti-vaccine who, until we did the science that we did, really didn't like Paul that much, because they thought, well, he's still vaccinating, so he must be one of those evil MDs. How can you vaccinate? This kind of question. Paul does what I think I would do if I was a physician, and I understood the rule of law in Oregon, the state law, and I understood the federal requirements, all of which protect your right to informed consent. See, what people don't understand is in the United States, there's different laws in different states that govern whether or not you, quote unquote, have to get a vaccine. You don't. It's not a mandate. It's a mandate with an exemption in most cases. But even the mandates with exemptions, you could just opt out by accepting the penalty for not vaccinating. That's the law of the land under Jacobson et al. Paul's aware of that, but what he wants to do is he wants to make sure that his patients have as much protection as possible, even if they are reluctant to get specific vaccines because they had a bad reaction to that specific vaccine. So in a way, he's caught in the crossfire, right? Like I am. I'm an objective scientist, so I can't say I'm an anti-vaxxer, even though people would like to paint me as an anti-vaxxer. I can't say it. That's too strong of a position. There are some conditions under which I can imagine that a vaccine might be very useful. And that's saying it, politically lightly. But the point is that Paul himself loves his patients. He cares for his patients. He doesn't spend 7 minutes to try to get as many patients through as possible in a well child visit. The first thing that he does in his practice is he takes the parent over to the CDC chart and he shows them the CDC chart and he says, okay, you're at this month, you're 3 months or 6 months, whatever. This is what the CDC recommends. Then he pulls out the vaccine information statements that the CDC provides to physicians to provide to the patients. He does this before he vaccinates, not afterwards. So the patients get to read all of the potential adverse events and so on. And then he looks for indicators that in his experience as a physician, he has seen when a child developed this kind of condition after vaccine before, they tend to have the same problem afterwards. That's practicing medicine. And so, this business of top-down cookie cutter one size fits all, the state of Oregon requires that physicians provide informed consent, and the federal regulations over human subjects research requires that every patient that's going to be vaccinated or their parents have to be informed that they're enrolling their child or themselves into a post-market surveillance safety study. No one ever does that. The public has been enrolled in vaccine safety studies for every vaccine you've ever had. I have 2 adult children. And I was never once asked, do you want to sign here if you want to enroll them in a post-market surveillance safety study? Now, there are people that know about the 21st Century Cures Act, and that 21st Century Cures Act allows doctors to enroll patients into clinical study, human subjects clinical study, if the doctor, or actually the people designing the study, have determined that the risk is generally low. Now, that's the problem. The problem of long-term vaccine safety studies is we don't know if the risk is generally low. And so you can't you can't use the 21st Century Cures Act loophole to say, well, we don't have to consent people for human subjects research. I think Paul is one of my favorite people in the whole world. I really do. And I'm not biased. I have to admit I'm biased that I like him enough to work with him. But I'm not just saying that to defend or promote the study. What I'm saying is he's really a gentleman. He's a soft-spoken person. There are some things happening to him right now that just couldn't happen to a nicer guy. That's the only way that you can say it. He absolutely does not deserve any of the criticisms. And we're working on a systematic program to respond to each allegation against Paul that the medical board has made in the suspension of his license. I see the suspension of his license as retaliatory for daring to publish the study. But what people have to understand is that the medical board asked Paul for this study.
Very interesting, Dr. Weiler. I was not aware that your colleague and co-author of the study, Dr. Paul Thompson, had his license removed. You believe it was due to the publication of this study?
Yeah, so it was actually suspended. There's very little hope that he'll get it back. However, that procedure is going to go along the way that it's got to go. But yeah, it was within a week and a half, within a week or so of our study being published, and it had reached tens of thousands of reads on the journal. Next thing you know, his license is suspended prior to a hearing instead of waiting for the hearing. And this is absolutely unprecedented, and I see it as retaliatory, and I think it's actually an amateur move on the part of the medical board, because what they've done now is they have infuriated every parent in America, every parent around the world, who knows that vaccines injured their children and that the government says, no, it never happened. And we're talking about millions and millions of people. So there's a whole team that's gathered around Paul. He's in high spirits. He's working hard every day, planning his defense and planning his next move. So stay tuned. It's going to be a really interesting rollout.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'd be interested in following that myself. Now, your colleague, Dr. Paul Thomas, he was a pediatrician. And so you guys gathered the information for this study based on his practice, like as you mentioned earlier. And this study was published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health on November 22nd, 2020. And it's been peer-reviewed. So this is a very recent study. These are very recent developments. Now, can you please explain the general premise of the study? You mentioned you had over 10 and a half years of information to work with, but I'd just kind of like to have a general overview of the study itself, like what it's, the vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and also the funding. We always have to ask, where did the funding for this come from?
Well, let's deal with the funding up front, because we'll dispense with that. The Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge is a not-for-profit registered to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, so we hung out a shingle and we collected funds from the public. The public is very responsive to that. And I'll do due diligence as the CEO of that not-for-profit corporation to let people know that phase 2 of the study is underway, so we still need donations. So if you don't mind, I'll say, please go to ipaknowledge.org, and find out how to donate. Most of the donations are small monthly donations, $2, $5. These is, by far, most of it is normal, everyday people who want science. When I've traveled around the country, being asked to educate legislative panels, actually through different countries now, to educate legislative panels, there's been a couple of times when I found myself on the steps of a Capitol building in one of the capitals of our great nation, leading a chant of the so-called anti-science anti-vaxxers. What do you want? And they respond, science. And I say, when do you want it? Now. And the reason why they say they want it now is because this study should have been done back in 1986, specifically when Congress told CDC to do it. CDC has refused to compare the health, the general well-being of children or people that have come through the schedule as children who are fully vaccinated compared to children who have never been vaccinated once in their life. So when Paul goes to the patients and he shows them the CDC schedule, he also has this other schedule called the vaccine-friendly plan. Now, the vaccine-friendly plan technically spaces out vaccines so you don't get more than one aluminum-containing vaccine per day. And it substitutes some aluminum-containing vaccines for non-aluminum-containing vaccines. Those are the most important differences. There are some other differences, but they have the option. They say, do you want to do the CDC schedule? Do you want to do this one? And it happens every time. He gets informed consent every office visit. So of the 3,700 patients that I had data for, there was a wide range of variation uptake among the people who were vaccinated. So it was not like we had two groups, fully vaccinated according to the CDC schedule and unvaccinated. We had 561 patients that were unvaccinated, and we had 2,784 who are partially or fully vaccinated. And so that allowed me to look at this in a slightly different way. What I could do is I could say the control group is the 561 who are unvaccinated. I'll look at that as the control group. And given that we have a control group, never seen a vaccine whatsoever, what about the kids that only have 5% of the vaccines or 10% of the vaccines and all the way up to 95th percentile and 100%, okay? So up to the 95th percentile, those are the most vaccinated. So the first thing I did with the data, and this is how you do good, robust, rigorous study design. First of all, I didn't analyze it 100 different ways and cherry pick the result like the CDC does. I have absolute provenance over every step of what I did. I ranked the patients from highest to lowest vaccine uptake. And then I looked at the relative, the number of times that kids in the most vaccinated group, the 95th percentile, had to go to the doctor related to things like anemia or eczema or allergic rhinitis or allergies. So we had all the medical records for these, all totally de-identified, 100% regulatory compliant. And I'm only saying that because it's important that people understand we're not just, cutting corners here in any way. So we have the most vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated with respect to how often they have to go to the doctor for their health conditions. These are billed diagnoses. So the first thing I did was I calculated the relative incidence of office visits. How often does a person have to go to the office because they have a complaint about whatever it is, sinusitis and so on. And so having done that, we can look at the chart, the graph, and we can look at over the range of this. And so the interesting thing that I noticed in the data is we had a great opportunity because we could use, if you look at figure 3 in the graph, you could actually use the wellness check or the well baby visit as a negative control. That's a control. So we could actually use the well baby visits as a negative control because those should be the same between high vaccinated or low vaccinated. The people that are getting more vaccines, they're going to the office just the same amount as the people that are getting no vaccines. These patients trust Dr. Thomas. They absolutely trust him. Now, the other interesting thing that we have in the data was a positive control. The positive control was fever. So we know that it is completely non-controversial that vaccines cause fever. So we know what the pattern should look like if kids are getting something from the vaccine in a causal setting. And sure enough, we found that the kids that were in the 95th percentile of having vaccines, they had more fever, and it's almost a linear relationship. So when we look at it that way, these kids are going to the office after getting the shot, coming back to the office because they have a fever. So that's an absolute positive control. So we got the wellness visit as a negative control, and we have the fever as a positive control. There's never been a study like this that's ever had the benefit of knowing what exactly. So this validates our rigorous approach to data analysis. So the results that we found in the relative incidence of office visits in the vaccinated versus unvaccinated. There's table after table after table, and I apologize for that, but the whole thing is very interesting. We have associations of so many conditions. The more vaccinated kids are, they have a higher risk of having to go to the billed office visit for sinusitis, breathing issues, asthma, and allergic rhinitis. So I call those autoimmune diseases of the airway. And that's what many scientists will recognize that phrase now, many medical practitioners. We have the same pattern for ADHD. If you look at the lowest, this is the interesting thing. Let me take a moment to talk about ADHD. There's 2,760 something who are vaccinating. There's 561 who are not vaccinating. In the 561 patients, there was 0 ADHD cases. So there's no ADHD in that unvaccinated population. So when we're looking at that, yeah, go ahead.
Now, can you tell us how many or what percentage there would be for the children who did receive vaccinations?
Yeah, I think the numbers are in a table here of the ADHD, a 50-fold. Well, yeah, compared to 0, it's infinity, but there's a 50-fold increase if you're in the upper quartile of ADHD in the vaccinated compared to the least vaccinated. So there's a couple of things that we had to do to make the comparison so we could fit them in the chart. But the list goes on, Spiro. There's gastroenteritis and weight and eating disorders and seizures that have the same pattern. There's ear pain, otitis media, eye disorders, conjunctivitis. Anemia was a big, strong signal. We had no idea. There's never been a study before that showed that anemia was associated with vaccination. This makes a great deal of sense. The signal was pretty strong. It was 14 times greater in the most vaccinated compared to unvaccinated. And it makes a great deal of sense because aluminum actually binds to a protein called transferrin. Transferrin actually is the protein where your dietary iron it gets bound to transport to your bone. So we know that aluminum moves to the bone, and we know that it binds to transferrin. So we know the mechanism. Well, these kids are not producing red blood cells at the same rate as the unvaccinated. They're producing far fewer because we can see that with anemia. Now we know why. We know why, I think causally, because the vaccines with aluminum, he doesn't have 0 aluminum on his schedule. So the vaccines that contain aluminum are actually inducing anemia. And if you think about brain development and a proper development of the body as a whole, a proper development of the immune system, you have to power it with oxygen, not just sugar. You have to have sufficient red blood cells. And so the fact that these vaccines may be inducing anemia should be a cause for grave concern.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you there with the findings because that's the whole point of the study, and it's extremely interesting. Now, you mentioned previously how the CDC was asked to do this study previously, and from what I understand, that there was 4 previous bills throughout recent history that would have required the CDC to accomplish this study, and all of them were shot down. And of course, it's no real big surprise of, I wonder why that would be when you consider that the pharmaceutical industry is the largest lobbying influence in DC. That may, I would think, assume would have something to do with that. But have there been other studies of vaccinated versus unvaccinated in the past? I know you say this one's quite, different from anything that's ever been done. Has there been other studies?
Yes, there have been. There are 2 that I know of, one from Germany and one from here in the United States that were survey studies. So a survey study is it's something, but you get what you pay for. I think if I were to do a survey study, I would get HIPAA permission from the patients to access their medical records so that we can verify the data. Because one of the criticisms of the survey studies is you don't know that people aren't joining the study out of activism. I mean, your channel is about activism, right? So we have to actually protect against that in some way. So although I'm all for activism when it comes to public health, when it comes to science, I have to draw a line, So I would, if I were to do or review, I actually reviewed one paper that had a result of a survey study on a different issue. It wasn't in vaccines, but one of my criticisms was that you have this selection bias. The selection bias that I'm going to talk about can apply to any study, including our own study, but it's working in our favor here. We would not have so many unvaccinated patients, if people didn't come to the practice and then have a baby, right, for their first child. I think there's a lot of people in this practice that are not vaccinated because they understand Paul respects informed consent. So it's really like the second baby selection bias. Probably a lot of the vaccine-free children are babies that were born into the practice because they're first or their second or third child. So if there's differences in health effect that way that we don't know about, it's a potential confounder, but it's really unlikely. I mean, we have increases in eczema and urticaria, dermatitis. So these are autoimmune conditions of the epithelial layers. And then the interesting thing is, and this is fairly complex, so I want to take my time with it. We did not find an association that was robust in the most vaccinated with autism or speech and social and learning delay. We found some increase in some of those, but the reason why we didn't is very interesting. It's very important when people that are paying attention to vaccine safety science that they understand things like the crunchy granola mom bias, that maybe the people who are vaccinating have a different lifestyle than the people that are not vaccinating. And the people that are not vaccinating are also eating organic food, and they're getting more sunshine, and all of this. And so what we did find was that in the first and second quarter of vaccine uptake, we saw an increase, a tendency towards increase in autism. But then it drops off in the most vaccinated, in the third and fourth quartile of vaccine uptake. And the reason why we think is because when Paul sees some indication, like a seizure or so on, he has a conversation with them and says, there have been some indication that perhaps seizures like this could be caused. Now, it's, again, not controversial that seizures are caused by vaccines. It's accepted. But it's said to be normal, and it'll go away, all right? So it's not like doctors don't talk about these seizures. They say, yeah, it happens, not a big deal. But what Paul then does is they come back and says, well, listen, okay, Bobby or Susie, they had seizures. We want to take a look at what happens to them if we don't vaccinate. So I don't know exactly what the terminology is. I haven't been in the office, but he talks with them about the relative risks that might be there, and then he abides by their decision. So he's protecting so many people from these developmental disorders. There were too few cases in the practice for a reliable and robust analysis, you see. So overall, we just said, okay, fair enough. We'll just kind of leave that alone. We report what the results are. And we did find in the second quartile of vaccine uptake that there was an increased risk of, I don't want to misquote it, about fourfold increased risk of autism. So just before the kids went on to get more vaccines, right, the vaccine uptake. So now there's a lot of results in this study. And the reason why there's a lot of results in this study, we also did this other thing, Spiro, where we wanted to be sure that the relative incidence of office visit was a rigorous measure. And since every other practice, every other study already used odds ratios and relative risks, we wanted to compare the results overtly out in the open. We're not cherry picking results. We're just saying, here's what the differences are. And the results are still there for many of these things. A 3.1 increase risk of itis media, dermatitis, 3.31, gastroenteritis. It's still there. But the natural question is, if we found this in this study and it doesn't use all the vaccines in all the patients, then what would happen in a fully vaccinated versus unvaccinated on the vaccine schedule? Well, the studies in the past that have used odds ratio, we show that our method of relative incidence of office visit using electronic medical records is more powerful than the odds ratio. We show that with simulations. So this has nothing to do with real data. The last part of it is a simulation to show that these two methods, all vaccine safety science going forward should use this relative incidence of office visits, or you might miss some adverse events. And that's really important. Now, other methodologies will come in, as they have before. With you mentioned at the top of this that I have made a contribution to the theoretical analytics and statistics and so on. And you're right, I have. And other people have been inspired by my methodology and created versions of their own. There's one test called the F-star test, and it's a test on survivorship. If you're taking this drug versus that drug, you have to map over time how much survivorship you're seeing. Very epidemiologic, okay? So, yeah, this kind of analysis is not overly complex if you take your time to understand it. I've had people who are not data analysts read it. They say they have to read it a couple times, but they're glad that it's done because now they can see going forward, we really should be able to tell the difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated in other studies since we have a more powerful measure.
So that's, I mean, you explained it pretty well for me. And I'm not a scientist or a doctor, and yeah, everything that you were saying there makes sense. And so, but I just want to, for clarification purposes, you would say the conclusion of your ongoing study, because you do have a phase 2 coming up, which I want to get more into here in a minute. But so phase 1 of this study, you would say unequivocally vaccinated children show higher rates of office visits. And so that means that there's something going on. They're having, like you said, these elevated levels of, this or that. I mean, would you agree with that? I mean, like,
yeah. I'm using office visits as a measure of disease burden. So the more severe a situation is, if a person has multiple asthma attacks, they're going to go in for different kinds of treatments. If the severity increases and that kind of thing. So, I would say that. Now, I'm glad you asked the question, because I would say that the data show that for Paul's study, for Paul's practice, I should say, for that particular pediatric practice, this pattern holds. For other practices that use CDC schedule, I have to say, I don't know if it applies or not. So there might be something magical that's in the CDC schedule that magically protects these kids from asthma that nobody knows about, dermatitis, whatever. The point is, it's just one data set. And what we want is other practices to do the same kind of practice for 10 years to see if we can reproduce the study.
Dr. Weiler, I think that's brilliant, realistically. And another point that I'd like to kind of reiterate on that you made previously was, there are a lot of other factors that could potentially influence, like you said, there's probably not only different family environments and lifestyles, but also our environments even geographically. Like if someone is living in a more industrialized area that has more forever chemicals in the water and all this other kind of stuff going on, sure. I'm sure they're going to have a little bit different results than a farm boy growing up eating, cornbread or whatever, something like that in the middle of nowhere. So that's really interesting. What can you tell us more about phase 2? What are you guys looking to accomplish here with phase 2?
Well, I want to follow up on your last comment first, if I might. What I found in my reading of thousands of studies in autism from my book, The Environmental and the Genetic Causes of Autism, was that kids who are with autism, and I've published since a major research paper on it, I think autism is an acquired cellular detoxification deficiency syndrome, where kids that have autism have less ability to detoxify, and that could be caused by environment itself. It could be caused by genetics as well. I think it's both. But they tend to absorb whatever local toxins are present. So if you're in an industrial area, you're going to pick up industrial toxins. If you're in agricultural, you're going to pick up agriculture. You're just not cleaning your body out as well. And it has a lot to do with cellular energetics, which involves the production of ATP molecules. It involves the production of red blood cells and so on. So if you starve the brain during particular parts of development and you're just anemic and nobody knows you're anemic, you're not going to be able to make those pathways. I think we're onto something with that anemia. So this study was rigorously peer-reviewed, and we had 2 reviewers that really liked it right off the bat. There was one reviewer that fought us every step of the way, and they would constantly say, well, how do we know that it's not that there's not differences in the age of these? So we pointed out to this reviewer that we had days of care matching. That's if you have one patient that has been in the practice for 43 days, we have another patient matched to it that also had 43 days, matched between the groups, vaccinated and unvaccinated. We had robust signal that survived that. What about if these are really just look at age? And so we did an analysis where we age matched. We looked at the oldest kids in the practice, and we did vaccinated versus unvaccinated, oldest versus oldest kid. And then we looked at vaccinated versus unvaccinated, youngest versus youngest kid. We found strong signals there too. There's just no way that we could make this association go away. And so rather than bury it, like William Thompson and his team ended up doing, against William Thompson's recommendations at the CDC, Thomas Verstraeten has an email where he said it just won't go away. Look up the Simpsonwood conference. It's incredible. The minutes that were secured by Safe Minds, actually, I was reviewing them recently. It's absolutely incredible what they said at the Simpsonwood document. I'll send you some slides soon. Maybe you can show some screenshots on that. But the actual statements that well, if the public finds out about this, it's going to affect their vaccine uptake. So, we don't want the public to find out about it. This kind of like thinking. And so what I did when I found that there were robust differences, it was in the eyes of the peer reviewers. We did it under the supervision of peer review. And I showed them the results and put it in the appendix, supplement, sorry. So the results are really super robust. And the last thing I want to say about phase 1 is if there is some kind of selection bias where it's the patients, the parents that are making decisions outside the practice about their lifestyle that cause these kids to have 50-fold less ADHD compared to the least vaccinated or no ADHD, every physician in the country and every scientist in the country should want to know what that lifestyle is, because we need to replicate that lifestyle right now in every family. I mean, we would be so much healthier if we just all ate granola or whatever it is they think, or wear Birkenstock sandals, whatever it is that they're doing. Okay, so my point is a bit facetious, but I think it's well taken. You got to take the health of kids seriously, and that's where that comes from. If it's not the vaccines that are doing it and you think it's a made-up imaginary confounder that you can think of, I can think of something else too. Okay, fine. Then what's the translational research paradigm program? Where's the priority in the NIH to find out what that lifestyle is? Oh my gosh, what a healthy lifestyle. Okay, so it's very important that we take all of these results seriously either way. They're not getting off the hook with me, not a day of it. So you asked about phase 2. In part given input from the peer reviewers, we'd like to compare the health effects of aluminum versus non-aluminum containing vaccines. I've done 3 research studies on the accumulation of aluminum under CDC schedule. Aluminum is a neurotoxin. There's paper after paper, study after study that shows it's not only a neurotoxin, it harms the ability of your cells to fold proteins properly. It can affect your mitochondria, cause mitochondrial damage. Aluminum in vaccines is injected in the people who are the frailest in our species. It's just incredible that we do this to them. So we're going to look at aluminum versus non-aluminum containing vaccines. We're also going to look at the effects of live virus vaccines versus non-live virus vaccines to see if there's a health effect there, to pick up on Peter Ube's research and his team's research to see if there's something there. We want to look to see also, and this was at that one really rigorous peer reviewer who was really giving us a hard time, and I deeply appreciate that rational criticism. He said to us, well, where's your temporal association? You have no temporal association here. We don't know causality. And I said to him, or her, I said, listen, for us to be able to do temporal association here, all the kids would have to have all of their sickness before they got their first vaccine, because we're doing cumulative exposure to vaccine, right? We're looking at the effect of having more and more vaccine compared to which vaccine caused what disorder and so on. So what we want to do in phase 3 is we want to look at specific associations between individual vaccines or combinations of vaccines and the timing of health outcomes, so the date to first diagnosis. And so that's why it's important that we take a look at this this phase 2 as continuation of the study, and I appreciate that very much.
And typically, how long, what kind of time frame on these studies? Like, how long did it take you guys to pour over 10.5 years of data and to accomplish this first phase of the study? And what do you anticipate for the next phase, time frame wise?
Right. So I don't know the full time because I came in after what was called a data quality check. There was a data quality check that went on for a while, but from the time that I received the data until the time that it was published was at least a year and 2 months or so. I absolutely expect that we're going to see new results within the next year if we get sufficient funding to fund that part of what we do at IPAC. We have a lot of other things going on as well. But other things going on as well, like Defend Dr. Thomas, right? So at the same time that we're doing these studies, I'm part of the team that's defending Dr. Thomas. Naturally, I'm going to stand up for my colleague. And so we expect an onslaught. We expect them to try to retract this first study. Absolutely. We know it. We know their game. There's people that go to specific journals. If a journal publishes anything that's negative about a vaccine, they have a team, a small group of people. It's the same people that go to journal after journal after journal, nitpicking and complaining about this and that, about the right to try to get it retracted. And so what I want to say is that we're going to be working on this for probably a year or longer. But if we could raise, I'll put a price tag on it. We did the first one for 100,000 or so. That included the initial filing for the Institutional Review Board and a person to help me write the proposal to the review board. Phase two is already approved, so we don't have to do that part. So somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 would be incredibly incredibly good to have for this. But I also want to put a plug in for Paul Thomas's defense, if I may. Yeah, he has a legal fund. If you go to paulthomasmd.com, you'll find Freedom to Choose, and you'll find the link there. It tells the story about what's happening to him. He's under assault 3 different ways. The donations go directly to his PayPal account for the legal fund. It's 100% to be used to pay for his legal fees and so on. There's other ways that he lists there on the website to be able to help, and I'll send you that link so you can show it. But it's really super important that we not let them destroy Paul Thomas's medical career. We have to get his medical degree unsuspended. And I want to say this, there's every reason for great hope, because it's not 30 years ago, right? What we have now is an entire population that's becoming educated every day about the realities of other people's experiences with vaccines. Before this, people really didn't talk about it. People said, oh, okay, I have this thing with my kid. Oh, yeah, you too? But now we have people going, oh, the same exact thing happened to your kid after vaccines? Okay. So I want to say something that my detractors, actually, they loathe me for saying it. All science begins with observations. And those of you that are suffering or have children in your family or family members who suffered from vaccine injury, your children are precious. Those experiences are precious observations to science. My goal in this, I don't have a vaccinated child. My goal in this is to save science. For what they've done for cooking the books on vaccines, this means pharma has learned how to conduct regulatory capture, to take over the EPA, to take over the FDA, to take over the CDC, to take over the NIH. I can give you the evidence, line out the evidence that the NIH is not-for-profit that they run. Your government runs a not-for-profit, so pharma can give money directly to NIH. It runs another one called the CDC Foundation with over $27 million a year that go to the, okay? And as you well know, the FDA gets most of their money from filing fees for approval for drugs, okay? So we have a very big problem in our society, and I'm working on a document called Plan B. Plan B will outline how we can have a safer public health infrastructure in the United States. And I'm really excited. It's submitted to the journal. It's under peer review right now. And when that comes out, I'll be happy to come back and talk with you about it.
I would appreciate that very much. I don't know if you can, how much you can give out, let the cat out of the bag on there, but I'm just curious. I have to ask, does removing the vaccine manufacturer's exemption liability, is that somewhere in Plan B? Because I think that would have a huge impact on, just accountability for starters,
Okay, so let me try it again. That's no problem. So if the public is successful in reclaiming public health, and that means we're going to work with the Senate and we're going to work with the Congress, right? And I know that's an uphill battle, but we can do it. Then we will build a different infrastructure that when it starts operating will very quickly identify the lack of liability for vaccine injury as a threat to public health.
Well, I can't wait to see Plan B. No doubt this medical industry has been taken over a long time ago, and it's been corrupted, and it's apparent to people like me from the outside looking in that they're not in it to create cures. They're in it to create repeat customers. A lot of these industries that we have in within this system. So it makes me very happy to see brilliant doctors, like yourself and others out there who are willing to stand up and speak out, and who are actually willing to do the science and say, see, show you, here it is. Because you would think that the CDC would want to do these studies. If the vaccines were so wonderful and helpful and beneficial, you think that they would themselves be falling over themselves to get these studies done. That way they can put it in your face and say, this is why you need to vaccinate your kids. But they're running from it. They're scared of it. So I think that's very telling. And the people, I think they see that. They smell through the garbage. So Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, IPACknowledge.org. It's been a pleasure having you on today. I appreciate your time. I feel like I could go on for another hour here. I have a bunch of other questions that I'd like to discuss, but that means we'll just have to have you back on again in the future. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I'd like to say we really didn't touch on coronavirus, but IPAC also works on coronavirus in a big, big way. So look up hashtag pathogenic priming on Twitter and look up hashtag cost of the false positives, and you'll find a lot of information there on those hashtags. Don't believe it when they tell you that there's no false positives. There are peer-reviewed published studies that show that false positives range anywhere from 11% to 42%. So if 11% to 42% of these so-called coronavirus cases are actually false positives on the test, then we have a serious problem. The light at the end of the tunnel is that there are many, many scientists. There's petitions to the FDA to force them to sequence the PCR product to make sure that what you have is a viable PCR amplification of the viral genome, not an off-target amplification. It just never stops. In my experience around coronavirus especially has been, in addition to everything else I do, I call it surfing. I'm surfing from issue to issue. I'm sure everybody can understand. Your head's spinning. It's about the testing. It's about the reporting. It's of all of it. Check out publichealthpolicyjournal.com and look at the peer-reviewed journals papers there. I'm the editor-in-chief there. I don't publish my own material there, peer-reviewed, and certainly not my research. I might publish editorials. But look at publichealthpolicy.com, and you'll find that we actually have a provenance document, peer-reviewed, they're showing that CDC may have broken the law on how they report cases of COVID and deaths due to COVID. So check that out too, and I can't wait to be back. It's going to be great.
I'm looking forward to it because I was hoping and planning on getting into COVID and the vaccine today, but this journal, this study that you and Dr. Thompson just did was so important, Dr. Thomas, that we have to. The time was well spent, and I really enjoyed it. And last question, this will be if you want, it could just be a yes or no. Do you plan on taking the COVID vaccine?
Myself, I have no intention whatsoever of taking the vaccine. No, it's not for me.
Understandable. I myself, it doesn't make sense. It's a 99+% survival rate if you're under the age of 70 and in good health, which I am, and. So I think my immune system is working just fine. So thanks again so much for your time, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler. Look forward to having you back on. All of the links will be in the show notes below. And for activistpost.com, I'm Spiro. Be sure to share this, and remember, it's only a matter of time before YouTube terminates this channel. So be sure to make your way over to my BitChute channel and subscribe there because they do not censor. And that's it for today. I'm Spiro. Thanks for watching.